Man's conquest of the interplanetary gulfs has been fraught with many tragedies. Vessel after vessel, like venturous motes, disappeared in the infinite, and had not returned. Inevitably, for the most part, the lost explorers have left no record of their fate. Their ships have flared as unknown meteors through the atmosphere of the further planets, to fall like shapeless metal cinders on a never-visited terrain, or have become the dead, frozen satellites of other worlds or moons. A few, perhaps, among the unreturning flyers, have succeeded in landing somewhere, and their crews have perished immediately or survived for a little while amid the inconceivably hostile environment of a cosmos not designed for men. In later years, with the progress of exploration, more than one of the early derelicts has been descried, following a solitary orbit, and the wrecks of others have been found on ultra-terrain shores. Occasionally, not often, it has been possible to reconstruct the details of the lone remote disaster. Sometimes, in a fused and twisted hull, a log or record has been preserved intact. Among others, there is the case of the Selenite, the first known rocket ship to dare the zone of the asteroids. At the time of its disappearance 50 years ago, in 1980, a dozen voyages had been made to Mars, and a rocket base had been established in Citrus Major, with a small permanent colony of terrestrials, all of whom were trained scientists as well as men of uncommon hardihood and physical stamina. The effects of the Martian climate, and the utter alienation from familiar conditions, as may have been expected, were extremely trying and even disastrous. There was an unremitting struggle with deadly or pestiferous bacteria new to science, a perpetual assailment of dangerous radiations of soil, air, and sun. The lessened gravity played its part also, in contributing to curious and profound disturbances of metabolism. The worst effects were nervous and mental. Queer, irrational animosities, manias or phobias never classified by alienists, began to develop among the personnel at the rocket base. Violent quarrels broke out between men who were normally controlled and urbane. The party, numbering 15 in all, soon divided into several cliques, one against the others, and this morbid antagonism led at times to actual fighting, and even bloodshed. One of the cliques consisted of 3 men: Roger Colt, Phil Gershom, and Edmund Beverly. These 3, through banding together in a curious fashion, became intolerably antisocial towards all the others. It would seem that they must have gone close to the borderline of insanity, and were subject to actual delusions. At any rate, they conceived the idea that Mars, with its 15 Earthmen, was entirely too crowded, voicing this idea in a most offensive and belligerent manner. They also began to hint their intention of faring even further afield into space. Their hints were not taken seriously by the others, since a crew of 3 was insufficient for the proper manning of even the lightest rocket vessel used at the time. Colt, Gershom, and Beverly had no difficulty at all in stealing the Selenite, the smaller of the 2 ships then reposing at the Citrus Minor base. Their fellow colonists were aroused one night by the cannon-like roar of the discharging tubes, and emerged from their huts of sheet iron in time to see the vessel departing in a fiery streak toward Jupiter. No attempt was made to follow it, but the incident helped to sober the remaining 12 and to calm their unnatural animosities. It was believed, from certain remarks that the malcontents had let drop, that their particular objective was Ganymede or Europa, both of which were thought to possess an atmosphere suitable for human respiration. It seemed very doubtful, however, that they could pass the perilous belt of the asteroids. Apart from the difficulty of steering a course amid those innumerable far-strewn bodies, the Selenite was not fueled or provisioned for a voyage of such length. Gershom, Colt, and Beverly, in their mad haste to quit the company of the others, had forgotten to calculate the actual necessities of their proposed voyage, and had wholly overlooked its dangers. After that departing flash on the Martian skies, the Selenite was not seen again, and its fate remained a mystery for 30 years. Then, on tiny remote Phocea, its dented wreck was found by the Haldane expedition to the asteroids. Phocea, at the time of the expedition's visit, was an aphelion. Like others of the planetoids, it was discovered to possess a rare atmosphere, too thin for human breathing. Both hemispheres were covered with thin snow, and lying amid this snow, the Selenite was sighted by the explorers as they circled about the little world. Much interest prevailed, for the shape of the partially bare mound was plainly recognizable, and not to be confused with the surrounding rocks. Haldane ordered a landing, and several men in spacesuits proceeded to examine the wreck. They soon identified it as the long-missing Selenite. Peering in through one of the thick, unbreakable neocrystal ports, they met the eyeless gaze of a human skeleton, which had fallen forward against the slanting, overhanging wall. It seemed to grin a sardonic welcome. The vessel's hull was partially buried in the stony soil, and had been crumpled and even slightly fused, though not broken, by its plunge. The manhole lid was so thoroughly jammed and soldered that it was impossible to effect an entrance without the use of a cutting torch. Enormous, withered, cryptogamous plants with the habit of vines that crumbled at the touch were clinging to the hull and the adjacent rocks. In the light snow beneath the skeleton-guarded port, a number of sharded bodies were lying, which proved to be those of tall insect forms, like giant phasmidae. From the posture and arrangement of their lank, pipy members, longer than those of a man, it seemed that they had walked erect. They were unimaginably grotesque, and their composition, due to an almost non-existent gravity, was fantastically porous and unsubstantial. Many other bodies, of a similar type, were afterwards found on other portions of the planetoid, but no living thing was discovered. All life, it was plain, had perished in the transarctic winter of Phocea's aphelion. When the Selenite had been entered, the party learned from a sort of log or notebook found on the floor that the skeleton was all that remained of Edmund Beverly. There were no trace of his two companions, but the log, on examination, proved to contain a record of their fate as well as the subsequent adventures of Beverly, almost to the very moment of his own death from a doubtful, unexplained cause. The tale was a strange and tragic one. Beverly, it would seem, had written it day by day, after the departure from Citrus Major, in an effort to retain a semblance of morale and mental coherence amid the black alienation and disorientation of infinitude. I transcribe it herewith, omitting only the earlier passages, which were full of unimportant details and personal animadversions. The first entries were all dated, and Beverly had made an heroic attempt to measure and mark off the seasonless night of the void in terms of earthly time. But after the disastrous landing on Phocea, he had abandoned this, and the actual length of time covered by his entries can only be conjectured. September 10th. Mars is only a pale red star through our rear ports, and according to my calculations, we will soon approach the orbit of the nearest asteroids. Jupiter and its system of moons are seemingly as far off as ever, like beacons on the unattainable shore of immensity. More often than at first, I felt that dreadful suffocation illusion which accompanies ether travel, of being perfectly stationary, in a static void. Gershom, however, complains of a disturbance of equilibrium, with much vertigo and a frequent sense of falling, as if the vessel were sinking beneath him through bottomless space at a headlong speed. The causation of such symptoms is rather obscure, since the artificial gravity regulators are in good working order. Colt and I have not suffered from any similar disturbance. It seems to me that the sense of falling would be almost a relief from this illusion of nightmare immobility. But Gershom appears to be greatly distressed by it, and says that his hallucination is growing stronger, with fewer and briefer intervals of normalcy. He fears that it will become continuous. September 11th. Colt has made an estimate of our fuel and provisions and thinks that with careful husbandry, we will be able to reach Europa. I had been checking up on his calculations, and find that he is altogether too sanguine. According to my estimate, the fuel will give out while we are still midway in the belt of asteroids, though the food, water, and compressed air would possibly take us most of the way to Europa. This discovery I must conceal from the others. It is too late to turn back. I wonder if we have all been mad, to start out on this errant voyage into cosmical immensity with no real preparation or thought of consequences. Colt, it would seem, has lost the power of mathematical calculation. His figures are full of the most egregious errors. Gershom has been unable to sleep, and is not even fit to take his turn at the watch. The hallucination of falling obsesses him perpetually, and he cries out in terror, thinking that the vessel is about to crash on some dark, unknown planet to which it is being drawn by an irresistible gravitation. Eating, drinking, and locomotion are very difficult for him, and he complains that he cannot even draw a full breath, that the air is being snatched away from him in his precipitate descent. His condition is indeed painful and pitiable. September 12th. Gershom is worse. Bromide of potassium and even a heavy dose of morphine from the Selenites' medicine lockers have not relieved him or enabled him to sleep. He has the look of a drowning man and seems to be on the point of strangulation. It is hard for him to speak. Colt has become very morose and sullen, and snarls at me when I address him. I think that Gershom's plight has preyed sorely upon his nerves, as it has on mine. But my burden is heavier than Colt's, for I know the inevitable doom of our insane and ill-starred expedition. Sometimes I wish it were all over. The hells of the human mind are vaster than space, darker than the night between the worlds. And all three of us have spent several eternities in hell. Our attempt to flee has only plunged us into a black and shoreless limbo, through which we are fated to carry still our own private perdition. I too, like Grisham, have been unable to sleep, but unlike him, I am tormented by the illusion of eternal immobility. In spite of the daily calculations that assure me of our progress through the Gulf, I cannot convince myself that we have moved at all. It seems to me that we hang suspended like Muhammad's coffin, remote from Earth, and equally remote from the stars. An incommensurable vastness without bourne or direction. I cannot describe the awfulness of that feeling. September 13th. During my watch, Colt opened the medicine locker and managed to shoot himself full of morphine. When his turn came, he was in a stupor, and I could do nothing to rouse him. Gershom had gotten steadily worse, and seemed to be enduring 1,000 deaths. So there was nothing for me to do but keep on with the watch as long as I could. I locked the controls anyway, so that the vessel would continue its course without human guidance should I fall asleep. I don't know how long I kept awake, nor how long I slept. I was aroused by a queer hissing whose nature and cause I could not identify at first. I looked around and saw that Colt was in his hammock, still lying in a drug-induced sopper. Then I saw that Gershom was gone, and began to realize that the hissing came from the airlock. The inner door of the lock was closed securely, but evidently someone had opened the outer manhole, and the sound was being made by the escaping air. It grew fainter and ceased as I listened. I knew then what had happened. Gershom, unable to endure his strange hallucination any longer, had actually flung himself into space from the selenite. Going to the rear ports, I saw his body, with a pale, slightly bloated face and open, bulging eyes. It was following us like a satellite, keeping an even distance of 10 or 12 feet from the lee of the vessel's stern. I could have gone out in a spacesuit to retrieve the body, but I felt sure that Gershom was already dead, and the effort seemed more than useless. Once there was no leakage of air from the interior, I did not even try to close the manhole. I hope and pray that Gershom is at peace. He will float forever in cosmic space, and in that further void where the torment of human consciousness can never follow. September 15th. We have kept our course somehow, though Colt is too demoralized and drug-sodden to be of much assistance. I pity him when the limited supply of morphine gives out. Gershom's body is still following us, held by the slight power of the vessel's gravitational attraction. It seems to terrify Colt in his more lucid moments, and he complains that we are being haunted by the dead man. It's bad enough for me too, and I wonder how much my nerves and mind will stand. Sometimes I think I'm beginning to develop the delusion that tortured Gershom and drove him to his death. An awful dizziness assails me, and I fear that I shall start to fall, but somehow I regain my equilibrium. September 16th. Colt used up all the morphine and began to show signs of intense depression and uncontrollable nervousness. His fear of the satellite corpse appeared to grow upon him like an obsession, and I could do nothing to reassure him. His terror was deepened by an eerie, superstitious belief. "I tell you, I hear Gershom calling us," he cried. "He wants company, out there in the black, frozen emptiness, and he won't leave the vessel till one of us goes out to join him. You've got to go, Beverly. It's either you or me. Otherwise, he'll follow the selenite forever." I tried to reason with him, but in vain. He turned upon me in a sudden shift of maniacal rage. "Damn you, I'll throw you out, if you won't go any other way," he shrieked. Clawing and mouthing like a mad beast, he leapt toward me where I sat before the selenite's control board. I was almost overcome by his onset, but he fought with a wild and frantic strength. I don't like to write down all that happened, for the mere recollection makes me sick. Finally, he got me by the throat, with a sharp-nailed clutch that I could not loosen, and began to choke me to death. In self-defense, I shot him with an automatic which I carried in my pocket. Reeling dizzily, gasping for breath, I found myself staring down at his prostrate body, from which a crimson puddle was widening on the floor. Somehow, I managed to put on a spacesuit, dragging Colt by the ankles. I got him to the inner door of the airlock. When I opened the door, the escaping air hurled me toward the open manhole together with the corpse, and it was hard to regain my footing and avoid being carried through into space. Colt's body, turning traversely in its movement, was jammed across the manhole, and I had to thrust it out with my hands. Then I closed the lid after it. When I returned to the ship's interior, I saw it floating, pale and bloated, beside the corpse of Gershom. September 17th. I am alone, and most horribly I am pursued and companioned by the dead men. I have sought to concentrate my faculties on the hopeless problem of survival, on the exigencies of space navigation, but it is all useless. Ever I am aware of those stiff and swollen bodies, swimming in the awful silence of the void, with the white, airless sun like a leprosy of light on their upturned faces. I tried to keep my eyes on the control board, on the astronomic charts, on the log I am writing, on the stars toward which I am traveling, but a frightful and irresistible magnetism makes me turn at intervals, and mechanically, helplessly, to the rearward ports. There are no words for what I feel and think, and words are as lost things along with the worlds I have left so far behind. I sink in a chaos of vertiginous horror, beyond all possibility of return. September 18th. I am entering the zone of the asteroids, those desert rocks, fragmentary and amorphous, that whirl in far scattered array between Mars and Jupiter. Today the selenite passed very close to one of them, a small body like a broken-off mountain, which heaved suddenly from the gulf with knife-sharp pinnacles and black gullies that seemed to cleave to its very heart. The selenite would have crashed full upon it in a few instants, if I had not reversed the power and steered in an abrupt diagonal to the right. As it was, I passed near enough for the bodies of Colt and Gershom to be caught by the gravitational pull of the planetoid. And when I looked back at the receding rock, after the vessel was out of danger, they had disappeared from sight. Finally, I located them with the telescopic reflector, and saw that they were revolving in space, like infinitesimal moons, about that awful naked asteroid. Perhaps they will float thus forever, or will drift gradually down in lessening circles, to find a tomb in one of those bleak, bottomless ravines. September 16th. I have passed several more of the asteroids, irregular fragments, little larger than meteoric stones, and all my skill of spacemanship has been taxed severely to avert collision. Because of the need for unrelaxing vigilance, I have been compelled to keep awake at all times, but sooner or later sleep will overpower me, and the selenite will crash to destruction. After all, it matters little. The end is inevitable, and must come soon enough in any case. The store of concentrated food, the tanks of compressed oxygen, might keep me alive for many months, since there is no one but myself to consume them, but the fuel is almost gone, as I know from my former calculations. At any moment, the propulsion may cease, then the vessel will drift idly and helplessly in this cosmic limbo, and drawn to its doom on some asteroidal reef. September 21st. Everything I have expected has happened, and yet by some miracle of chance or mischance, I am still alive. The fuel gave out yesterday, at least I think it was yesterday, but I was too close to the nadir of physical and mental exhaustion to realize clearly that the rocket expulsions had ceased. I was dead for want of sleep, and had gotten into a state beyond hope or despair. Dimly, I remember setting the vessel's controls through automatic force of habit, and then I lashed myself in my hammock and fell asleep instantly. I have no means of guessing how long I slept. Vaguely, in the gulf beyond dreams, I heard a crash as far-off thunder, and felt a violent vibration that jarred me into a dull wakefulness. A sensation of unnatural, sweltering heat began to oppress me as I struggled toward consciousness. But when I had opened my heavy eyes, I was unable to determine for some time what had really happened. Twisting my head so that I could peer out through one of the ports, I was startled to see, on a purple-black sky, an icy, glittering horizon of saw-edged rocks. For an instant, I thought that the vessel was about to strike on some looming planetoid. Then, overwhelmingly, I realized that the crash had already occurred, that I had been awakened from my coma-like slumber by the falling of the selenite upon one of those cosmic islets. I was wide awake now, and I hastened to unlash myself from the hammock. I found that the floor was pinched sharply, as if the vessel had landed on a slope or had buried its nose in the alien terrain. Feeling a queer, disconcerting lightness, and barely able to re-establish my feet on the floor, I gradually made my way to the nearest port. It was plain that the artificial gravity system of the flyer had been thrown out of commission by the crash, and that now I was subject only to the feeble gravitation of the asteroid. It seemed to me that I was light and incorporeal as a cloud, that I was no more than the airy specter of my former self. The floor and walls were strangely hot, and it came to me that the heating must have been caused by the passage of the selenite through some sort of atmosphere. The asteroid, then, was not wholly airless, as such bodies are commonly supposed to be, and probably it was one of the larger fragments with a diameter of many miles, perhaps hundreds. But even this realization failed to prepare me for the weird and surprising scene upon which I gazed through the port. The horizon of serrate peaks, like a miniature mountain range, lay at a distance of several hundred yards. Above it, the small, intensely brilliant sun, like a fiery moon in its magnitude, was sinking with visible rapidity in the dark sky that revealed the major stars and planets. The selenite had plunged into a shallow valley, and had half buried its prow and bottom in a soil that was formed by decomposing rock, mainly basaltic. All about were fretted ridges, guttering pillars and pinnacles, and over these, amazingly, there clambered frail, pipey, leafless vines with broad yellow-green tendrils, flat and thin as paper. Insubstantial-looking lichens, taller than a man, and having the form of flat antlers, grew in single rows and thickets along the valley. Between the thickets I saw the approach of certain living creatures, who rose from behind the middle rocks, with the suddenness and lightness of leaping insects. They seemed to skim the ground with long, flying steps that were both easy and abrupt. There were 5 of these beings who no doubt had been attracted to the fall of the selenite from space, and were coming to inspect it. In a few moments, they neared the vessel and paused before it with the same effortless ease that had marked all their movements. What they really were, I do not know, but for want of other analogies, I must liken them to insects. Standing perfectly erect, they towered 7 feet in air. Their eyes, like faceted opals at the end of curving protractile stalks, rose level with the port. Their unbelievably thin limbs, their stem-like bodies, comparable to those of the phasmidae, or walking sticks, were covered with gray-green shards. Their heads, triangular in shape, were flanked with immense perforated membranes, and were fitted with mandibular mouths that seemed to grin eternally. I think they saw me with those weird, inexpressive eyes, for they drew nearer, pressing against the very port, till I could have touched them with my hand if the port had been open. Perhaps they too were surprised, for the thin eye stalks seemed to lengthen as they stared, and there was a queer waving of their shared arms, a quivering of their horny mouths, as if they were holding converse with each other. After a while they went away, vanishing swiftly beyond the near horizon. Since then, I have examined the selenite as fully as possible to ascertain the extent of the damage. I think that the outer hull has been crumpled, or even fused in places, for when I approached the manhole clad in a spacesuit, with the idea of emerging, I found that I could not open the lid. My exit from the flyer had been rendered impossible, since I have no tools with which to cut the heavy metal or scatter the tough neo-crystal ports. I am sealed in the selenite as in a prison, and the prison, in due time, must also become my tomb. Later, I shall no longer be able to date this record. It is impossible, under the circumstances, to retain even an appropriate sense of earthly time. The chronometers have ceased running, and their machinery has been hopelessly jarred by the vessel's fall. The diurnal periods of this planetoid are, it would seem, more than an hour or 2 in duration, and the nights are equally short. Darkness swept upon the landscape like a black wing after I had finished writing my last entry, and since then, so many of those ephemeral days and nights have shuttled by that I have now ceased to count them. My very sense of duration is becoming oddly confused, now that I have grown somewhat used to my situation. The brief days drag with immeasurable tedium. The beings whom I call the walking sticks have returned to the vessel, coming daily, and bringing scores and hundreds of others. It would seem that they correspond in some measure to humanity, being the dominant life form of this little world. In most ways, they are incomprehensibly alien, but certain of their actions bear a remote kinship to those of men, and suggest similar impulses and instincts. Evidently, they are curious. They crowd around the selenite in great numbers, inspecting it with their stalk-born eyes, touching the hull and ports with their unattenuated members. I believe they are trying to establish some sort of communication with me. I cannot be sure that they emit vocal sounds, since the hull of the flyer is soundproof. But I'm sure that the stiff, semaphoric gestures which they repeat in certain order before the port as soon as they catch sight of me are fraught with conscious and definite meaning. Also, I surmise an actual veneration in their attitude, such as would be accorded by savages to some mysterious visitant from the heavens. Each day when they gather before the ship, they bring curious spongy fruits and porous vegetable forms which they leave like a sacrificial offering on the ground. By their gestures, they seem to implore me to accept these offerings. Oddly enough, the fruits and vegetables always disappear during the night. They are eaten by large, luminous flying creatures with filmy wings that seem to be wholly nocturnal in their habitats. Doubtless, however, the walking sticks believe that I, the strange ultrastellar god, have accepted the sacrifice. It is all strange, unreal, immaterial. The loss of normal gravity makes me feel like a phantom, and I seem to live in a phantom world. My thoughts, memories, my despair are all no more than the mists that waver on the verge of oblivion, and yet, by some fantastic irony, I am worshipped as a god. Immeasurable days have gone since I made the last entry in this log. The seasons of the asteroid have changed. The days have grown briefer, the nights longer, and a bleak winteriness pervades the valley. The frail, flat vines are withering on the rocks, and the tall lichen thickets have assumed funeral autumn hues of matter and move. The sun revolves in a low arc above the saw-toothed horizon, and its orb is small and pale, as if it were receding into the black gulf amongst the stars. The people of the asteroid appear less often. They seem fewer in number, and their sacrificial gifts are rare and scant. No longer do they bring sponge-like fruits, but only pale and porous fungi that seem to have been gathered in caverns. They move slowly, as if the winter cold were beginning to numb them. Yesterday, 3 of them fell, after depositing their gifts, and lay still before the flyer. They have not moved, and I feel sure they are dead. The luminous night-flying creatures have ceased to come, and the sacrifices remain undisturbed beside their bearers. The awfulness of my fate has been closed upon me today. No more of the walking sticks have appeared. I think that they have all died. The ephemera of this tiny world that is bearing me with it into the Arctic limbo of the solar system. Doubtless their lifetime corresponds only to its summer, to its perihelion. Thin clouds have gathered in the dark air, and snow is falling like fine powder. I feel an unspeakable desolation, a dreariness that I cannot write. The heating apparatus of the selenite is still in good working order, so the cold cannot reach me, but the black frost of space has fallen upon my spirit. Strange, I did not feel so utterly bereft and alone while the insect people came daily. Now that they come no more, I seem to have been overtaken by the ultimate horror of solitude, by the chill terror of an alienation beyond life. I can write no longer, for my brain and my heart fail me. Still, it would seem, I live, after an eternity of darkness and madness in the flyer. of death and winter in the world outside. During that time I have not written in the log, and I know not what obscure impulse prompts me to resume a practice so irrational and futile. I think it is the sun, passing in a higher and longer arc above the dead landscape, that has called me back from the utterness of despair. The snow has melted from the rocks, forming little rills and pools of water, and strange plant buds are protruding from the sandy soil. They lift and swell visibly as I watch them. I am beyond hope, beyond life, in a weird vacuum. But I see these beings as a condemned captive sees the stirring of spring from his cell. They rose in me like an emotion, whose very name I had forgotten. My food supply is getting low, and the reserve of compressed air is even lower. I am afraid to calculate how much longer it will last. I have tried to break the neo-crystal ports with a large monkey wrench for hammer, but the blows, owing partly to my own weightlessness, are futile as the tapping of a feather. Anyway, in all likelihood, the outside air would be too thin for human respiration. The walking stick people have reappeared before the flyer. I feel sure, from their lesser height, their brighter coloring, and the immature development of certain members, that they all represent a new generation. None of my former visitors have survived the winter, but somehow the new ones seemed to regard the Stellanite and me with the same curiosity and reverence that were shown by their elders. They, too, have begun to bring gifts of unsubstantial-looking fruit, and they strew filmy blossoms below the port. I wonder how they propagate themselves, and how knowledge is transmitted from one generation to another. The flat, lichenous vines are mounting on the rocks, are clambering over the hull of the selenite. The young walking sticks gather daily to worship. They make those enigmatic signs which I have never understood, and they move in swift gyrations about the vessel, as in the measures of a hieratic dance. I, the lost and doomed, have been the god of 2 generations. Perhaps they will still worship me when I am dead. I think the air is almost gone. I'm more lightheaded than usual today, and there is a queer constriction in my throat and chest. Perhaps I'm a little delirious, and I have begun to imagine things. But I have just perceived an odd phenomenon, hitherto unnoted. I don't know what it is. A thin, columnar mist, moving and writhing like a serpent with opal colors that change momentarily, has disappeared among the rocks and is approaching the vessel. It seems like a live thing, like a vaporous entity, and somehow it is poisonous and inimical. It glides forward, rearing above the throng of phasmidae who have all prostrated themselves as if in fear. I see it more clearly now. It is half-transparent, with a web of gray threads among its changing colors, and it is putting forth a long, wavering tentacle. It is some rare life form, unknown to earthly science, and I cannot even surmise its nature and attributes. Perhaps it is the only one of its kind on the asteroid. No doubt it has just discovered the presence of the selenite and has been drawn by curiosity like the walking stick people. The tentacle has touched the hull. It has reached the port behind which I stand, penciling these words. The gray threads in the tentacle glow with a sudden fire. My God. It's coming through the neocrystal lens.